Dust rose from the wagon wheels like smoke from a dying fire. The girl stood beside it, her hands twisted in the folds of her skirt, her left leg trembling beneath her weight. The bone had healed wrong years ago, bending her stride into a limp. Her father stood a few feet away, thick hands on his belt, voice low and rough as gravel. "She's no use at home," he said. "Can't plow, can't herd. Eats more than she earns." The trader's yard smelled of sweat, whiskey, and sun-baked hides. 3 men watched from the porch, laughing under their breath. The trapper stood apart, half-shadowed beneath the brim of a battered hat. He had the look of a man carved out of silence, leathered skin, eyes the color of storm that never broke. When he spoke, the words came slow. "What's your price?" The father spat, rubbed his jaw. "Rifle, 2 mules, sack of grain." The trapper didn't argue. He reached into the wagon and laid the goods out on the ground like an offering. The rifle gleamed, polished, heavy, worth more than the girl. A quiet settled over the yard. The father's eyes flicked from the weapon to the trapper's face, waiting for mockery or negotiation. There was none. The girl didn't look up. The laughter from the porch turned sharp. One man called, "Hell, she's got a pretty enough face if you don't mind a limp." Another snorted. "He don't want a wife, just help skinning pelts." The trapper said nothing. He fastened the rifle strap to his saddle, then nodded once. "We're done here." He turned, the movement calm, absolute. The girl's father grabbed her arm, shoved her toward him. "Go on then. You belong to him now." She stumbled, caught herself before she fell. When she straightened, she saw the trapper watching her, not with hunger or pity, just quiet assessment, like a man deciding whether a wild creature would bite. Her throat tightened, but she said nothing. The laughter faded behind her as they rode out the trading post, the sound of hooves cutting through dust and distance. They rode without words. The mountain rose ahead, blue and cold against the burning sky. She clung to the saddle horn, her leg aching with every step of the horse. The trail wound upward through pine and shale. Somewhere far below, she could still hear echoes of her father's voice, the clang of iron, the hollow trade that had ended her old life. She thought of her mother's grave, the small wooden cross near the creek that no one visited anymore. The thought burned, then faded into the rhythm of hoofbeats. As the sun began to sink, the trapper halted near a ridge. "We camp here." His voice was low, but carried a kind of patience she hadn't expected. He dismounted, gathered wood. She slid from her horse, nearly falling when her weak leg buckled. He didn't offer a hand, only watched until she steadied herself. Then he tossed her a blanket and started a fire. When flames caught, he unwrapped dried venison, handed her a strip. She ate without looking at him. Her stomach knotted. After a while she asked, her voice barely above the wind, "Why'd you buy me?" He looked into the fire. "Didn't buy you. Bought quiet." She almost laughed, a bitter sound. "You could have got that cheaper." He shrugged, pulled his coat tighter. "Maybe." The wind carried the scent of snow from the peaks above. Coyotes yipped somewhere in the dark, their cries threading through the stillness. The girl drew the blanket around her shoulders, feeling the weight of what she'd lost and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. When she woke, dawn had turned the mountain pink. The trapper was already saddling the horses. They rode higher that morning, the air thinning, the world spreading beneath them like an ocean of pine. Occasionally he glanced back, not to speak, but to make sure she was still there. By midday, they passed the charred bones of a homestead, a blackened chimney, a half-buried wagon wheel, the smell of rain and old ash. She stared as they passed. "What happened there?" "Raid," he said. "Long time ago." "Indians?" He shook his head. "Men." That was all. She turned in her saddle to look again, but the ruins were already swallowed by distance. When the sun dipped low again, they reached a clearing beside a frozen lake. A small cabin stood at the edge, half hidden by pines. The logs were dark with weather, the roof heavy with snow. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, thin and gray. He dismounted, tied the horses. "This is home." She stepped inside after him. The cabin was sparse. A table, A few pelts hanging from the rafters, a rusted lantern. A rifle leaned by the door. On the shelf above the hearth lay a worn Bible, its pages frayed by years of handling. She hovered near the doorway, unsure. He pointed toward a small cot. "You'll sleep there. What about you?" "Fire'll do." He spread his bedroll near the hearth, without another word. She watched him, trying to decide what kind of man he was. His face gave nothing away, just the calm of someone long past caring what people thought of him. She wanted to ask about his scars, the deep one cutting across his wrist, but didn't. That night, she couldn't sleep. The wind rattled the cabin walls. Wolves howled somewhere across the lake. She lay awake, thinking of her father's laughter, of the way the men had looked at her like she was something less than human. Anger flickered through the fear, hot and quiet. When she turned her head, she saw him sitting by the fire, awake, staring into the flames. The light softened his face, made him look almost kind. His hands were working on something small, a torn boot, hers. He was mending it with thread, and a bone needle, movement steady and practiced. She closed her eyes, pretending to sleep, but the sight stayed with her. No one had ever fixed something of hers before. By morning, the snow had begun to fall, slow flakes drifting over the frozen water. She stepped outside, wrapped in his old coat. The air bit her lungs, but it felt clean, honest. For a moment she forgot the shame of yesterday. The world up here seemed untouched by trade or cruelty. The trapper was splitting wood behind the cabin. When he noticed her, he stopped, rested the axe in the snow. Their eyes met, brief, cautious, almost curious. There was no pity in his gaze, no judgment, just the quiet acknowledgement of two lives caught in the same wind. She wanted to speak, to ask where he came from, why he lived alone, but the words died before they reached her mouth. Instead, she limped down to the edge of the lake and knelt, brushing snow from the ice until her reflection stared back, pale, thin, eyes fierce despite everything. Behind her, the axe rose and fell, steady as a heartbeat. That night, as she lay on the cot, the last thing she heard before sleep was a low crackle of the fire and the faint hum of his breath, steady in the dark. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. But she wasn't foolish enough to believe she was safe, either. There was something in the man's silence, something vast and unfinished. The mountain was keeping its secrets, and so was he. The mountain changed with the first snow. It fell softly at first, a thin white skin over the pines and stones. But within days, the drifts grew deep enough to swallow the sound of hooves. The girl learned to move through that silence, fetching water from the creek, stacking firewood where he told her to. Her limp slowed her, but did not stop her. The cold burned her lungs, and she liked that. It reminded her she was still alive. The man spoke little. His words, when they came, were plain and weighted. Each morning he left before dawn, carrying his traps down into the ravine. By the time he returned, the light had already turned blue, and the smell of pine smoke hung in the air. She cooked what he brought, rabbit, grouse, sometimes trout from the half-frozen stream. At first she moved around him like a shadow, careful not to anger him. But he never raised his voice. He never raised his hand. He watched her quietly, the way a hunter studies a trail. Curious, not cruel. Once, when she dropped a bowl and flinched as though expecting a blow, he said only, "It's clay, not bone." She didn't answer, but the words stayed with her. In the still hours before dawn, when the fire sank low and the world held its breath, she began to wonder who he had been before the wilderness claimed him. His face bore the stories of long winters and longer regrets. The scars on his hands told of labor and battle both. Sometimes she caught him staring at the horizon, not like a man watching for weather, but like one measuring distance from a past that would not die. One afternoon she cut her palm skinning a rabbit. The knife slipped quick and bright. He crossed the room before she could hide the wound. His hand was rough, calloused, but gentle as he poured whiskey over the cut and wrapped it in linen. She flinched at the sting. He didn't let go until she met his eyes. "Won't heal if you keep hiding from it," he said. She almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the words felt heavier than the cut itself. "You talk like you know something about wounds," she said. He tied the knot tight, his face unreadable. Everyone up here is bleeding somewhere. After that, something changed between them, not warmth exactly, but a small easing, a thread of understanding drawn through silence. He started teaching her things, how to set snares, how to mend a pelt, how to read the shape of a storm from the way the trees leaned. She learned quickly, her hands nimble even when her body faltered. Sometimes, as they worked side by side, she felt his gaze linger, not the hungry stare she had known from men in the lowlands, but the quiet recognition of another survivor. It unnerved her more than cruelty would have. When the snow deepened, they stayed inside for days. The wind screamed around the cabin, shaking the shutters. Smoke from the chimney drifted low and gray. Inside, the fire painted their faces in gold and shadow. They played no cards, told no stories, but the silence between them began to feel less like a wall and more like a room they both occupied. One evening, while he sharpened his knife by the fire, she asked, "Why live up here alone?" He didn't look up, didn't start alone. The answer hung there, bare as bone. She wanted to ask more, but his eyes had gone distant, and she recognized that kind of silence. It was the same kind she carried when memory pressed too close. Later that night, she dreamed of her father's voice again, the sound of laughter turning to gunfire. When she woke, the fire was low, and he was sitting in the same place, the knife still in his hand. His gaze was on the flames, and for a moment she thought she saw something raw flicker across his face, a grief so old it had hardened into habit. Days passed. They repaired traps, boiled hides, mended boots. She began to hum while she worked, old tunes from childhood, songs her mother had sung to drown out her father's temper. The first time she hummed, he stopped mid-motion. The tune was faint, half-remembered, but something in it made him stand still as stone. When she noticed the stillness, she fell silent. "What?" she asked. He blinked, as if surfacing from a dream. "Nothing," he said, but his voice had changed. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, staring at the knife again, though this time he didn't sharpen it. The melody haunted him. He had heard it before, long ago, on a night filled with smoke and blood. The memory came in fragments. A burning valley, soldiers shouting orders, a child's cry rising over the roar of flames. He pressed his palm against his forehead, as though the pressure could hold the memory down. At dawn, when she woke, she found him outside by the lake, breaking ice with an axe. His movements were sharp, almost desperate. She didn't speak to him. She knew the look of a man wrestling ghosts. The winter deepened, and with it came a fragile rhythm. She began to move through the cabin, as though it belonged to both of them. He built her a walking stick from a young pine branch, carved smooth, its handle polished by his own hands. When he handed it to her, she hesitated before taking it. "Why?" she asked softly. "You'll move faster," he said. Then, after a pause, less pain, she nodded, unable to speak. No one had ever cared about her pain before. The mountain turned blue with cold. Nights grew long, filled with the hiss of the fire and the slow crack of ice outside. She found herself thinking less about the people who sold her and more about the man across the firelight. How he never smiled, how his silence sometimes seemed to guard her rather than punish her. One morning, when she was collecting snow for water, she saw him standing near the ridge, rifle in hand, staring down the valley. She limped closer and followed his gaze. Far below, in the pale distance, a line of riders moved across the flat land. Tiny, dark figures cutting through white. "Hunters?" she asked. He lowered the rifle, eyes narrowing. Could be. But there was something in his voice she didn't trust. She watched the riders disappear into the trees and felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. When they went inside, he packed extra ammunition into a box near the hearth. She pretended not to notice, but the sight of it made her throat tighten. That night, she sat by the fire and dared to ask, "Were you a soldier?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Once." "Did you fight in the war?" He shook his head slowly. No war worth naming. Just men doing what they were told until they couldn't live with it anymore. She turned the stick he'd carved over in her hands. "You still carry it." He stared into flames. "Some things follow you whether you walk or crawl." The wind rose outside, battering the door. The firelight flickered across their faces, hers lined with quiet defiance, his with exhaustion that looked older than either of them. For a long while, neither spoke. Then, in a low voice, she said, "The night they sold me, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen. Maybe it wasn't." He met her gaze. "Don't mistake survival for mercy." "I don't," she said. "But sometimes it's enough." The wind quieted. Snow pressed against the windows like breath. In that fragile silence, something shifted between them again. Not love, not yet, but recognition. Two broken lives that had stopped pretending to be whole. Later, as the fire dimmed, she saw him close his eyes and rest his hand against his chest, as though feeling for a heartbeat he wasn't sure he still owned. She thought, for the first time, that he might be lonelier than she was. The snow had begun to thin by the time they saw the first tracks. Hoof prints, half melted, pressing deep into the mud below the ridge. The man crouched beside them, fingers brushing the edge of one print as though feeling for its pulse. His eyes hardened. "They're not hunters," he said quietly. The woman felt her stomach tighten. "Who then?" He didn't answer, only looked toward the valley where smoke rose in a thin line against the gray sky. The smell of it reached them, wood, tar, something else beneath. She recognized it before he spoke. "Whiskey fire," he murmured. "Men camping low. Too many for peace." She thought of the riders she'd seen weeks ago. The memory returned sharp and cold. The way they'd moved, slow and certain, like men who already owned what they were riding toward. He straightened, face drawn tight. "Pack what you need." The words were plain, but she heard what he didn't say. They weren't moving for safety. They were preparing for company. Inside the cabin, he began checking his rifles, laying bullets in even rows across the table. The sound of metal against what echoed through the small room like distant thunder. She watched him, uneasy. His movements were methodical, too calm. The silence felt like the breath before a storm. "Who are they?" she asked. He paused. "People who think they've still got a claim." "On you?" His gaze lifted, unreadable. "Maybe on you." The words hit her like a blow. For a moment she couldn't breathe. "My family's down south." "They wouldn't." "They would," he said. "You told me enough." She remembered the day she was sold, the sneer on her brother's face, the way her father had refused to look at her. Shame turned over in her chest, sharp as glass. "Why now?" she whispered. "Men don't forget debts," he said, "or property they think is theirs." By dusk, the first riders appeared at the edge of the lake. 3 at first, then 4 more trailing behind. They rode in loose formation, their horses snorting steam into the cold air. The leader dismounted and shouted across the clearing, "We're looking for a girl." The man stepped outside, rifle in hand. "Ain't any girl here," he called back. His voice carried flat and hard through the thin air. The woman stood in the doorway, the barrel of a pistol heavy in her palm. She couldn't see their faces through falling snow, but she heard laughter, the kind that scraped bone. A voice she knew too well answered, "That's a lie, old man. I know she's here. I can smell her fear." Her brother. The world seemed to narrow to the sound of her own heartbeat. The trapper's stance didn't shift, but his voice dropped, quiet as a knife drawn from its sheath. "You best turn back." Her brother spat into the snow. "You think I came this far to leave empty-handed? She's ours. Always was." She stepped out from the doorway before the trapper could stop her. "I'm not yours," she said, the words trembling but clear. "You sold me. You lost the right to even speak my name." He laughed, the sound cold and wild. "You think a sale changes blood?" Her hand shook, but she kept the pistol aimed low. "It does when the blood's rotten." The trapper's voice cut through the air. "Last warning." Her brother's grin vanished. "You'll regret that." The first shot cracked the air open. The trapper moved fast, too fast for a man his age. His rifle roared, splintering a tree beside one of the riders. Horses reared, men shouted, the air filled with gun smoke and snow. The woman dropped behind the woodpile, heart hammering. Bullets tore through the cabin walls. The trapper rolled behind a boulder, firing in measured bursts. His calm unnerved her more than the noise. Each shot was deliberate, each pause like a held breath. She crawled toward the window, raised a pistol, and fired once. A man tumbled from his saddle, blood blooming dark across the snow. For a heartbeat she felt nothing. Then the tremor came, her hand shaking so hard she nearly dropped the gun. The trapper's voice carried from the ridge. "Reload." She fumbled with the pistol, clumsy fingers slipping on the cold metal. Another shot rang out close, too close, and she heard with Splinter behind her. She ducked low, breath sharp and fast. When the smoke thinned, the riders were pulling back toward the trees. 2 lay still in the snow. The rest were shouting orders, regrouping. Her brother's voice rose above them, furious and shrill. "You'll pay for that, old man. You both will." Then they were gone, disappearing into the storm. The clearing fell silent, except for the hiss of wind through the pines. The trapper lowered his rifle slowly, eyes scanning the tree line. "They'll be back," he said. She nodded, throat raw. "You're hurt," she managed. A dark line of blood ran down his arm, soaking through his sleeve. He looked at it as though it belonged to someone else. "It'll keep." Inside, she cleaned the wound with trembling hands. The bullet had grazed him, but the skin around it was angry and red. He didn't flinch while she worked, just watched her face with a kind of quiet concern that made her chest ache. "You've done this before," he said softly. She tied the bandage tight. "Men like my father give you practice." He almost smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You shot one of them." She looked away. "I had to." "Yeah," he said. "You did." The silence that followed was thick and strange. The fire hissed. Outside, the snow fell steady again, covering the bodies by the lake in a clean white sheet. That night, as he slept, she sat by the window, watching the tree line. Every shadow looked like movement. Every gust of wind, like a whisper of return. She thought of her brother's voice, the hatred in it. He wouldn't stop. He never had. When dawn came, the world was wash pale. She went to the lake to fetch water and saw the footprints leading away from the cabin. Their tracks, and others deeper, heavier. She followed them a short distance before stopping. In the snow lay a torn scrap of cloth. It was from her brother's coat. On it, a smear of dry blood. She turned it over in her hand, remembering the night years ago when he had cornered her behind the barn, his breath thick with whiskey, his laughter mean. She had tried to stop him. Her mother had stepped between them, screaming. The gun had gone off. The bullet had gone through her leg. Her brother had said it was her fault. Her father had believed him. Now, standing in the snow, she felt that old wound burn like it was fresh. She wanted to run, to hide, but something in her refused. Maybe it was a mountain, or the man asleep inside, or the memory of the firelight on his face, when he said she'd done what she had to. When she returned, he was awake, sitting by the fire, cleaning his rifle again. He looked at her, reading the truth in her expression, without her saying a word. "They were your blood," he said quietly. "They stopped being that a long time ago." He nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. "Then this ends here." Her breath caught. "You can't kill them all." "I don't plan to," he said, "but I'll make sure they don't come again." She stared at him, the weight of those words sinking deep. "And if they do?" His eyes lifted to hers, gray, steady, unafraid. "Then the mountain decides." For a long moment neither spoke. The fire snapped, sparks leaping toward the ceiling. Somewhere outside, a wolf howled, long, mournful, endless. She didn't know what would come next, only that whatever it was, she wouldn't face it running. The fear that had once ruled her had changed shape. It was still there, but now it burned like. The thaw came late, slow and uneasy. Snow peeled from the pines in heavy sheets, revealing the black bones of the forest beneath. Streams broke loose from ice and sang through the valley again. The woman stood at the doorway of the cabin. Her hand on the rifle the man had given her. The world felt too bright now, the light too sharp after so many weeks of gray. He was outside, mending the corral fence with his wounded arm bound tight. His movements were slower than before, but steady. She knew he was watching the tree lean, even when he didn't look at it. They had not spoken much since the night of the attack. There was nothing left to say. Words had done their work. Now it was silence and preparation. She cleaned the rifles twice a day, gathered what little food remained, mended torn coats. At night, when the fire burned low, she could hear him breathing in his sleep, a rough sound that reminded her he was still alive. Sometimes she dreamed of her brother's voice, the way he called her name in the snow, not out of love or guilt, but ownership. She would wake with her hand clenched around the rifle, the taste of iron in her mouth. On the morning the riders returned, the lake was still half frozen. The sound reached them first, a faint tremor in the air, hooves striking thawed ground, the rhythm unmistakable. The man looked up from the fence, his face calm, expressionless. "They're here," he said. She didn't answer. She was already moving, checking the rifle, loading the chamber. Her fingers didn't shake this time. He watched her for a moment, something like pride flickering behind his eyes. "You don't have to stand with me," he said. "I know." He hesitated, then nodded once. "Then we stand." The riders appeared through the trees, 7 now, their shapes blurred by mist and light. Her brother led them, face pale and raw with rage. He called out, voice carrying clear over the water. "You think you can hide behind some old ghost? You think the mountain makes you safe?" The man stepped forward, the rifle resting easy in his hands. "You've already lost what you came for," he said. Her brother laughed. "Not yet." The first shot cracked across the clearing, and the world broke open. The man moved with precision that seemed older than thought. Each shot he fired was an answer, clean and final. Horses screamed, men fell. The woman took her place beside the window, eyes cold and steady. Her first bullet missed, the second didn't. A rider pitched backward into the mud. They returned fire, splintering wood, tearing through the walls. Smoke filled the cabin, sharp and choking. She could barely see him through the haze, but his voice cut through it, low, measured. "Keep your breath. Don't rush the aim." She did. Another rider fell. But then a sound ripped through her ears, the shatter of glass, a sudden grunt. She turned and saw him stagger, his shoulder dark with blood. He didn't fall, only shifted his stance, reloading with grim efficiency. "Get down," he ordered. She ignored him. "You can't hold him alone." Wasn't planning to. The fight dragged on, a rhythm of thunder and silence, smoke and breath. By the time the last bullet rang out, the clearing was a graveyard of red and thawing snow. Her brother still stood, swaying near the tree line, his revolver shaking in his hand. She stepped outside before the man could stop her. Her limp slowed her, but she moved with purpose, the rifle steady at her side. Her brother's face twisted when he saw her. "You came all this way to die for him?" "I came to end it." He laughed, a wet, broken sound. "You won't shoot me. You never could." "You're right," she said, lifting the rifle. "I won't hesitate this time." His hand twitched toward the revolver, but she fired first. The shot hit true. He fell backward into the snow, the echo rolling through the valley like thunder fading into silence. For a moment, she just stood there, staring. The mountain wind rushed through the clearing, lifting her hair, carrying the smell of smoke and gunpowder away. When she lowered the rifle, her hands were steady. The man came up beside her, limping slightly. Blood darkened the sleeve of his coat, but his eyes were clear. He looked down at the body, without expression. "It's done," he said. She nodded, though her breath trembled. "It doesn't feel done." "It never does." They stood there until the wind buried the blood under new snow. Then she turned toward the cabin. "You're bleeding too much," she said. He smiled faintly, almost surprised. "You sound like you care." "Someone has to." Inside, she cleaned the wound again, hands sure and careful. The bullet had gone deep this time. He stayed silent while she worked, his jaw tight. When she finished, he leaned back against the wall, pale and sweating. "You could leave now," he said. "No one's left to stop you." She tied the bandage off. "And go where?" "Anywhere. You're free." She looked at him for a long time, the firelight flickering across his face. "Freedom's not about leaving," she said. "It's about choosing to stay." He tried to answer, but the effort pulled the strength from him. She sat by him until his breathing evened out. Outside, the world had gone quiet again. The mountain seemed to hold its breath. When dawn came, smoke rose from the ruins of the fight. The bodies were gone, taken by wolves or by mercy. She stepped outside, her coat drawn tight, watching the light crawl across the snow. It was the same mountain, but everything in her felt altered, as if something had been scraped away and replaced with something raw and new. He stood with effort, his face lined with pain, but his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "You could build something here," he said. "The land's good enough. Water's clean. It's quiet." She smiled faintly. "You sound like you're talking to yourself." "Maybe I am." They began to rebuild that morning. He mended what he could of the cabin, and she cleared the broken glass, swept the floor, patched the roof with hides. Their hands moved in silence, but it wasn't the old silence anymore. It was something gentler, something earned. Days passed, then weeks. The snow retreated higher into the peaks, leaving the ground soft and green. The woman tended a small fire outside, cooking trout over the coals. The man carved wood nearby, shaping it into something small and intricate. A bird, wings spread as if caught mid-flight. She looked up at him, eyes bright with the reflection of the fire. Maybe we both did. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and pine. In the distance, thunder rolled softly, but it sounded less like a threat now, more like a promise. That night, as the rain came down, they sat by the fire and listened. He told her his name at last, the one he had buried years ago along with the man he used to be. She said it quietly once, then again, letting it settle into the air like a prayer. When the storm passed, dawn came clean and gold. The lake shimmered, unbroken. Smoke rose from their chimney in a thin, steady line. She walked to the water's edge, her limp lighter now, the reflection staring back at her no longer broken. Behind her, he called out something about breakfast, his voice rough but alive. She turned toward him, the mountain at her back, the sun warm on her face. Once, she had been sold for being lame. Now, she stood unshaken, her gaze steady, the truth of her life written clear her eyes. And somewhere above them, the mountain watched, indifferent and eternal, as if it understood what they had done and why it mattered. The world would forget their names, but not their echo.